So this concert is going to involve some fantastic works by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Anton Arensky, Carlos Guastavino, Cole Porter, and George Bizet. Sit back and enjoy. Our first work today is a two-piano sonata by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in D major K448, the only sonata he wrote for two pianos, and it is one of his most incredible works, or some have called it his best work, just the most perfectly structured a piece of music that you could play, and such a joy to perform. A couple of wonderful quotes about Mozart. Of course, he was one of the great child prodigies of all time. Wendy Wasserstein, the playwright, said, "It's because of Mozart that it's all over by the age of 7." And other people recognized his incredible genius. Goethe, the great German playwright and poet who saw Mozart as a young boy, said, "A phenomenon like Mozart remains an inexplicable thing." And the great Albert Einstein, who himself was a very good violinist, loved Mozart. He said, "Mozart is the greatest composer of all. Beethoven created his music, but the music of Mozart is of such purity and beauty that one feels he merely found it, that it has always existed as part of the inner beauty of the universe waiting to be revealed." And my favorite quote of all, Mozart, of course, unfortunately dies at the age of 35, and it's remarkable what he could accomplish in those years, over 620 fantastic works. The satirist Tom Lear said once, "It's a sobering thought to think that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 5 years." So a remarkable man, so full of joy and spirit. But he was not always the nicest guy, and rather juvenile at times in his letters. You read his letters, they're filled with sort of scatological references and poops and toots and all of that, and it almost feels like you're reading the letters of a 14-year-old boy, even when he's older. And this piece was written in 1781, right after he gets to Vienna. He escapes his father's tutelage in Salzburg and decides to make it on his own. And he ends up staying at the home of the Auernhammer family, probably for free rent in exchange for teaching their daughter, Josefa Barbara, the piano. And she was a very good pianist. In fact, this piece was written for her as the primo pianist. But this is what Mozart writes back to his father shortly after he begins his stay there. "I will not attempt to describe the mother here. Suffice it to say that when I am at the table, it is all I can do not to burst out laughing. She is both stupid and malicious. Now for the daughter. If a painter wanted to portray the devil to the life, he would have to choose her face. She is as fat as a farm wench, perspires so that you feel inclined to vomit, and goes about so scantily clad that really you can read as plain as print, 'Pray do look here.' True, there is enough to see there, in fact, quite enough to strike one blind. But one is thoroughly well punished for the rest of the day if one is unlucky enough to let one's eyes wander in that direction. Tartar is the only remedy. So loathsome, dirty, and horrible, faugh, the devil. But she is not content if I spend a couple of hours with her every day. She wants me to sit there the whole day long, and what is more, she tries to be attractive. But what is worse still, she is seriously in love with me. I thought at first it was a joke, but now I know it to be a fact. The whole town is full of talk that we are going to be married. People are wondering why I would take someone with a face like hers." Now, that's not nice. To her credit, she wrote back at some point in the same year to Mozart a little letter. She said, "I am no beauty. Au contraire, I know I am ugly. I have no desire to marry some chancery official with an income of 300 or 400 gulden, and I have no chance of getting anyone else. So I prefer to remain as I am and to live by my talent." And she did have a lot of talent. Mozart clearly thought she was a phenomenal pianist, and she also began to compose music soon after this. And in fact, she wrote a wonderful variations of Papageno's aria from the Magic Flute shortly after Mozart died. So it was not a nice letter that Mozart wrote, but at least he wrote her a fantastic piece of music. And Alfred Einstein, not related to Albert, but who wrote an important biography of Mozart, described this piece. He says, "The art with which the two parts are made completely equal, the play of the dialogue, the delicacy and refinement of the figuration, the feeling for sonority in the combination and exploitation of the different registers of the two instruments, all these things exhibit such mastery that this apparently superficial and entertaining work is at the same time one of the most profound and most mature of all Mozart's compositions." Now, there's another interesting side story to this piece. It's such a perfectly designed piece. The structure and the proportions, everything is fantastic, that there was a study done in 1993 by a psychologist named Frances Rauscher. And she played 10 minutes of this piece to college students and determined that there was a rise in spatial reasoning after they heard this piece. Now, she actually wrote about this in Nature magazine and said it was only lasted about 10 minutes, this increased ability to reason spatially. But the whole thing was kind of blown out of proportion in the next couple of years. And in fact, there was this whole myth that exploded that listening to classical music at a young age will make you do better on standardized tests. And I remember this as a kid and when I was in school in the 90s. And in fact, in 1998, Georgia's governor, Zell Miller, ended up distributing free classical musical CDs to every baby born in the state of Georgia. And then they followed suit in Tennessee. And there was this whole cottage industry of Mozarts for babies that came up, hoping that they would get people smarter by listening to the music. Now, I do think you get smarter just by listening to the music, but it can certainly be overblown. However, there was actually a study soon after by the British Epilepsy Organization, again, using this piece. They determined that they reduced the number of seizures in people with epilepsy when this piece was played because of its predictability and the structure and the harmonic consonants. So hopefully we'll make you all smarter. Sit back and enjoy all three movements of the Mozart Sonata in D major for two pianos, K448. next piece is a fantastic waltz from the first suite for two pianos by Anton Arensky. This was written in 1888. Arensky actually wrote four whole suites for two pianos. He loved that combination, but this is the most famous movement of the ones that he did. He was born in 1861. He dies, unfortunately, quite early at the age of 40 because of too much drinking and gambling. He went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory and studied with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and then after graduating, he became the professor of composition at the Moscow Conservatory, and some of his students included Alexander Scriabin and Sergei Rachmaninoff, who we'll hear shortly. And Arensky became the director of the Imperial Choir in St. Petersburg for most of his life as well. His teachers thought he had a lot of talent, but may not have come out to too much. One of the sad quotes is by Rimsky-Korsakov, his teacher. He said, "In his youth, Arensky did not escape some influence from me. Later, the influence came from Tchaikovsky. He will quickly be forgotten." And unfortunately, he mostly was, although there's a fantastic piano trio that still gets performed, and these two piano suites do get performed. So we just thought we'd give you this waltz by Anton Arensky. Our next work is by the great Sergei Rachmaninoff, a student of Arensky, and this is from his second suite for two pianos, and it's the slow movement, the Romance, the third movement from that piece, one of the glorious movements. And this is a piece that came around at a really important time in Rachmaninoff's life. Now, Rachmaninoff was born in 1873 and grew up in a sort of aristocratic family, although the father ended up squandering most of the money. As Rachmaninoff said about his father, he was a wastrel, a compulsive gambler, a pathological liar, and a skirt chaser. He eventually leaves the family when Rachmaninoff's about 10 or 11, and Rachmaninoff spends most of his time with the mother and the maternal grandmother, who was helped to teach him piano early on, and he was a very good pianist and went off to the St. Petersburg Conservatory at about the age of 11, but unfortunately fails out of there in his teenage years because he is so lazy. All the teachers say this is a remarkable student, but he does no work. And he was then shipped off to a relative, Nikolai Zverev, who was a piano teacher at the Moscow Conservatory, but was also known for taking in talented young boys and sort of giving them some discipline. And Rachmaninoff lived there and would practice 8 hours a day under the stern guidance of Zverev. And ultimately, that really helped him. And he ends up then going back into the Moscow Conservatory when he's 18 or 19. And he becomes one of the star pupils there. And in fact, wins the great gold medal, one of the few people to actually get the highest honors at the conservatory. And he meets Tchaikovsky there, and Tchaikovsky dies in 1893, just as he's graduating. And there's a sense that Rachmaninoff is going to take the mantle from Tchaikovsky. This talented young kid is going to be the next superstar of Russian composition. And so everyone is waiting for his first symphony, which comes out in 1896. And sadly, it is a complete disaster. Here's how Rachmaninoff describes it. He said, "I imagined that there was nothing I could not do, and I had great hopes for my future after graduating conservatory. It was in the confidence bred of this feeling that I composed my first symphony in D minor, and the ease with which I worked encouraged my pride and self-esteem. I had a very high opinion of my work, which was built up on themes taken from the choir book of the Russian church service. The joy of creating carried me away. I was convinced that here I had discovered and opened up entirely new paths in music." It didn't turn out to be that way. There was not a lot of time for the orchestra to rehearse, and there were some rumors that perhaps the conductor, Glazunov, who was a known alcoholic, was drunk during the performance. But in any case, Rachmaninoff didn't enjoy the show. He said, "It is true that the performance was beneath contempt, and the work in parts unrecognizable to me. But apart from this, its deficiencies were revealed to me with a dreadful distinctness even during the first rehearsal. During the evening of the performance, I could not go into the concert hall. I left the artist's room and I hid myself sitting on an iron fire escape staircase which led into the gallery of Nobility Hall. There I spent the time huddled on a step while my symphony, which had fanned in me such great expectations, was being played. I lived through the terrible experience again and again. It was the most agonizing hour of my life. Sometimes I stuck my fingers in my ears to prevent myself from hearing my own music, the discords of which absolutely tortured me. Only one thought hammered in my brain: how is it possible? What is the cause of it? All my hopes, all belief in myself was destroyed." Unfortunately, there was a horrible review that came out soon afterwards by César Cui, one of the mighty five of the generation before, who was known to be quite a ruthless reviewer. But he said the following: "If there were a conservatory in hell, and if one of its talented students were to compose a programmed symphony based on the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, and if he were to compose a symphony like Mr. Rachmaninoff's, then he would have fulfilled his task brilliantly and would have delighted the inhabitants of hell. To us, this music leaves an evil impression, with its broken rhythms, obscurity and vagueness of form, meaningless repetition of the same short tricks, the nasal sound of the orchestra, the strained crash of the brass, and above all, its sickly, perverse harmonization, quasi-melodic outlines, complete absence of simplicity and naturalness, and no theme whatsoever. That's a really bad review. And unfortunately, it really just, everything snapped for Rachmaninoff. And he said the following: I returned to Moscow a changed man. My confidence in myself had received a sudden blow. Agonizing hours spent in doubt and hard thinking brought me to the conclusion that I ought to give up composing. I was obviously unfit for it, and therefore it would be better if I made an end to it at once. A paralyzing apathy possessed me. I did nothing at all and found no pleasure in anything. Half my days were spent lying on a couch, sighing over my ruined life. I felt like a man who had had a stroke and lost the use of his hands and his heart. And that's how he stood for a few years, just barely alive. And it was a family friend, the hypnotist Nikolai Dahl, who would actually get him out of this stupor. And through hypnotism, he went for about 6 months. And over, Dahl would say, "You will begin to write a concerto. You will work with great facility. It will be a great piece of music." And ultimately, it worked. And Rachmaninoff wrote his second piano concerto. And after that, the dam kind of broke. And he writes this 2-piano suite and the beautiful cello sonata. And you can hear in this movement, it starts off slow and beautiful, but there's a moment where it just builds to this incredible climax. And it's almost as if 3 years of a depression is just being blown apart. And Rachmaninoff is smiling and thanking the gods that he's got inspiration back. And we thank him for doing it. It's a glorious piece of music. We hope you enjoy the Romance from the second suite by Sergei Rachmaninoff. Our next work is by a composer not well known in America. His name is Carlos Guastavino. He was an Argentinian composer, had a very long life, born in 1912 and dies in the year 2000. And really wrote an incredible amount of works, over 500 works, although most of them smaller songs and short piano pieces. But the problem was that he did not like a lot of modern music at a time when that was in vogue. His style was very conservative, very tonal, and kind of lusciously romantic in the style of Rachmaninoff. As he once said, "I love melody, I love to sing. I refuse to compose music only intended to be discovered and understood by future generations." And he based a lot of his music on Argentinian folk music. And he was actually such a wonderful writer of songs that he's sometimes called the Schubert of the Pampas. That's the area, the Santa Fe province that he grew up in. This is a piece he actually wrote in 1951, and it has just this lush sound. It's called Tres Romances. We're going to do the first movement of the girls, Las Niñas, from this incredible piece. And one last quote, I can't remember who said it, but somebody described Guastavino as Schumann with a little tequila poured over it. We hope you enjoy Las Niñas by Carlos Guastavino. Our next piece is a work you will probably be familiar with. It is a couple of the excerpts from the opera Carmen by Georges Bizet in a two-piano arrangement by Richard Simm. This is, of course, one of the great works ever written. But when it was first premiered, it was a pretty big failure. And unfortunately, Bizet died only about a month before the premiere, while it was still being shown. So he never saw it become the most popular opera of all time. In fact, he thought he had written a failure. Bizet was born in 1838. His full name, Alexander César Leopold Bizet, was a phenomenal young talent on piano. Won the Outstanding Pianist Award at the Paris Conservatory and the Prix de Rome as Best Composer in 1857, sent to Italy for a few years. But he really struggled when he started off to get his music heard. The critics didn't seem to like his music. He was really depressed. And so when he finally gets around to writing Carmen in 1874, he thinks he's on to something. As he wrote to a friend, "All the critics make out that I am obscure, complicated, tedious, more fettered by technical skill than lit by inspiration. Well, this time around, I have written a work that is full of clarity, vivacity, color, and melody." And of course, he was absolutely correct, as some of the great tunes of all time. But that's not exactly how it turned out. Unfortunately, there was a lot of complaints by even friends of his. Charles Gounod, who was his mentor, famous opera composer, apparently accused Bizet of plagiarizing his melody for Michaela's aria. He said, "Bizet has robbed me. If you take the Spanish tunes and the ones that I wrote out of the score, there remains nothing to Bizet's credit but the sauce that masks the fish." That's not very nice. Others complained that there were no good tunes. I don't know what they were listening to. They thought it was dull and obscure. The ear grows weary of waiting for the cadence that never comes. And ultimately, Bizet wrote to that same friend, "I foresee a definite and hopeless flop." And most of the complaints were really about the fact that there was this really amoral seductress. Carmen was not your usual woman opera character. She had real backbone, and it was actually also the first time that somebody was killed in an opera on stage. In the past, if someone was going to die, you sort of heard about it backstage. But here at the end, Carmen is killed by Don Jose, who she sort of whipped into a crazy frenzy, and he's ruined his life, fallen in love with her. But there's a great letter written by Jean Dupin, who was a friend of the librettist, Mayak, and he wrote to him, "I will not mince words. Your Carmen is a flop, a disaster. It will never play more than 20 times. The music just goes on and on and on. It never stops. There's not even time to applaud. That's not music. And your play, that's not a play. A man meets a woman, he finds her pretty. That's the first act. He loves her. She loves him. That's the second act. She doesn't love him anymore. That's the third act. He kills her. That's the fourth. You call that a play? That's a crime, do you hear me? A crime." So there were many people who did not love this music, but we all still think of it as one of the great, great works. And there's one wonderful quote by Bizet at the end of his life. He said, talking about music, he said, "What a beautiful art it is, but what a wretched profession." So we hope you enjoy this arrangement from a couple of tunes from Georges Bizet's Carmen. thought we would do one last piece. Hopefully you're all clapping at home. So we thought we'd give you a little encore, a small little bonbon, as we call it. And this is a wonderful arrangement of Cole Porter's Begin the Beguine, arranged by a guy named Cy Walter. Cole Porter's always been one of my favorite composers, largely because, like myself, he's a Harvard Law School dropout. He actually was born in Peru, Indiana, and his father, Samuel Porter, was a pharmacist by trade, a kind of a weak person. But his mother, Kate Cole, so they put the two names together, Cole and Porter. Cole was the daughter of a guy named James Cole, who was known as the richest man in Indiana, a coal and timber speculator. And young Cole Porter showed some great talent. He was playing violin at 6, piano at 7, and he wrote his first operetta when he was 10 years old. He was sent to Yale College in 1909, was actually one of the first Whiffenpoofs there, the a cappella group, and was president of the Yale Glee Club. He also wrote over 300 songs while he was there, including the Yale fight song that they still use. And then his grandfather sort of gently encouraged him to go to Harvard Law School, which he did. But after a year there, the dean at the law school actually thought that he might be better off going to the music school at Harvard. So he went to the music school. He told his mother, but the mother never told the grandfather. So when graduation time came, the grandfather thought he was getting a little lawyer, and instead he got a musician. And Cole Porter at that point ran off to France to join the Foreign Legion and spend the most of the 20s with the Roaring Twenties and the Lost Generation there in Paris. So those of you who saw Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen film, Cole Porter's house was sort of the center of a lot of great parties. And Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, all those people were hanging out with Cole Porter. But he eventually does make his way back to New York. And struggles for a little bit to get her shows going. He was one of the few of the great songwriters who also wrote his own words, and they were very witty, urbane lyrics. But finally, with Anything Goes in 1934, he really hits the mark. And this piece, Begin the Beguine, was from a show called Jubilee. And it was all written while Porter was on a Pacific cruise in 1935. In fact, this song was supposedly written somewhere between Kalabahi, Indonesia, and Fiji. And that's why you get this sort of a Beguine sound to it. It's a complex song. It's not the normal type. It doesn't really follow the rules of songwriting. And for that reason, it wasn't very successful right off the bat. But there was actually a young band leader named Artie Shaw, who was not well known at the time, who made an extended swing orchestra version of Begin the Beguine in 1938. And it shot to the top of the charts. In fact, the record company didn't think it was going to be very successful, so it was released on the B-side of the record Indian Love Call. But it became the number 3 best-selling record of 1938, and after that, numerous other bands began to play it. It was included in the MGM film Broadway Melody of 1949, with Fred Astaire and Eleanor Powell dancing to it. And in fact, the great German artist Max Beckmann even named one of his paintings in 1946, Begin the Beguine. This is an arrangement, as I mentioned, by Cy Walter, who was a kind of a cafe society pianist in New York City for much of the 20th century. He was dubbed the Art Tatum of Park Avenue. Born in Minneapolis, but he played at some famous clubs, the Algonquin, the Blue Angel, ran his own club briefly, the Cy Walter Nightcap, and then he began appearing in the late 1940s and 1950s as part of these 2-piano teams, and he made lots of great arrangements of 2-piano songs. There was a weekly radio series called Piano Playhouse that he appeared on, and then ultimately he began playing at the Drake Room of New York's Drake Hotel, and that's where he really got well known. People like Frank Sinatra and others would come listen to these great arrangements that he did, and they really fell in love with it. So here's a great arrangement, Cy Walter arrangement of Begin the Beguine by Cole Porter.